Welcome to the TExES 391 Core Subjects EC6 Online Test Prep course, covering Subject Exam Number 1, English, Language Arts, and Reading, Test Number 901. This course is presented by Teacher Preps, your trusted source to help you pass your teacher certification exam. Thanks so much for being here. Let's get started. As you can recall from the NES and Texas Education Standard Administration website, the Texas Core Subjects 391 English Language Arts and Reading exam has a total of 10 competencies. This lesson is all about competency number 10, which reads, Assessment of Developing Literacy. The teacher understands the basic principles of literacy assessment and uses a variety of assessments to guide literacy instruction. Now, if you have a look at competency number 10, we can see a list of 14 descriptive statements below, which means that competency number 10 is the longest of all the 10 competencies. Yay, right? The test administrators have been polite enough to save us the longest for last. All right, but even if you're feeling worried about test day, don't be, because I've got you covered. Grab your pen and pad and follow along to take notes as this lesson progresses. We'll work along this lesson step by step through every single descriptive statement so that you are totally prepared for test day. Without further ado, let's begin. Standard 1 of Competency 10 reads, The beginning teacher knows how to select and administer formative and summative assessments to students in grades 4 through 6 and use results to measure literacy skills such as word analysis and word identification skills, fluency, comprehension, writing conventions, written communications, visual images, inquiry skills, and also address individual student needs identified in formal and informal assessments. Now, because this is the 10th lesson in our TExES Core Subjects Test Prep program, you're probably aware that each time I see a big descriptive statement like this, I like to break it down so that we can dissect and better understand what's expected of us on test day. So first, I'm going to eliminate the examples in the parentheses. Great. So that we already have something, a statement that feels more manageable. Now let's highlight the key parts. Notice here how we have 3 colors because there are 3 major sections. The first is that we know how to select and administer formative and summative assessments. Second, use those results that we collect to measure students' literacy skills. And third, to be able to take those student results and address individual needs that appear from the results. Now, before we learn to select and administer assessments, we need to know what the different kinds are and when they are best used for students. So let's cover that now. Here are when we use formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments are ongoing checks for understanding, often used during the learning process. These help educators monitor student learning, providing feedback that can be used by teachers to modify subsequent lessons. Summative assessments, on the other hand, evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional period and are often benchmarked against standards. Next, take note of these examples in case you come across a question on your exam where you're asked about assessments. One example of a formative assessment could be an exit ticket. This is where, at the end of a lesson, students can be asked to respond to a prompt, a question, or a task related to the day's lesson on a small piece of paper. For example, after a lesson on similes, students might be asked to write their own simile related to a given topic. Another example is using Think, Pair, Share, where after a reading or discussion, students think about a question posed by the teacher, discuss their thoughts with a partner, and then share with the class. This can be used after reading a story segment where students might be asked to discuss a character's motivations or the main idea of the passage. Next, we have reading journals. This is when students can maintain a journal where they respond to their readings. This might include predictions, questions, connections, and summaries. Now, periodically, the teacher can review these journals to gain insight into student comprehension, connections, and inferences. And another example is concept mapping, where after a lesson, students can create a visual map linking concepts and ideas and characters or events to demonstrate their understanding of the skill being taught on that day. Next, let's go through some examples of summative assessments. Remember, the key difference between a formative and a summative assessment is that formative is informal, which helps the teacher do a quick temperature check for how the students are understanding the material before or during a lesson or unit, whereas summative is formal. These assessments are done after a lesson or a unit. Let's go through some examples of summative assessments now. Beginning with end of unit tests. These can assess students' comprehension and understanding of key concepts, vocabulary, and skills taught throughout a unit. One example could be after a unit on narrative structures, the test might include multiple choice, short answer, and essay questions about the elements of a story, literary devices, and narrative techniques. Another example of a summative assessment could be a research project where students can be assigned topics or allowed to choose their own related to a particular theme or author studied in the class. They would then conduct research using multiple sources and present their findings in a written report, a poster, or a multimedia presentation. Up next are student portfolios, where over the course of a term or a school year, students can compile a portfolio of their best written pieces, projects, and other related assignments. This showcases their growth, achievements, and areas of proficiency in various ELA, English Language Arts, skills. Now, the portfolio can be accompanied by a self reflection piece where students evaluate their own progress and set their own goals for future learning. To provide a recap example, an educator in a fifth grade classroom might use formative assessments like daily journal checks or in class discussions to gauge student comprehension, while a summative assessment might be an end of the unit exam or a standardized test. All right, great. Now that we understand the difference, let's discuss examining, selecting, and administering formative and summative assessments in grades 4 through 6. Now, as summative assessments are low stakes checks to provide the teacher with a snapshot of student understanding, if on your exam you're asked to identify the correct formative assessment, follow this guide when selecting the appropriate formative assessment. Number one, if you're asked which informal assessment can give insights into reading, fluency, and comprehension, do you know what to use? All right, use observations. If on the test day you're asked which formative assessment is used best in order to check word identification or comprehension skills, use a quiz. And if you are presented with a question on test day that asks you, how would you show a student's thought process for learning new vocabulary and comprehension understanding as they engage with challenging units? Use reading journals. Sticking with formative assessments, let's move from selecting the assessment to learning to administer a formative assessment following these three guidelines. First, make sure the formative assessments are frequent to regularly used in order to check for understanding. Second, ensure they are varied to cater to different learning styles, such as oral, written, and group activities. And also, third, provide feedback promptly to guide further learning. Now let's move from selecting and administering formative assessments to summative ones. Recall that summative assessments evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit against some standard or benchmark. Now, if on your exam you're asked to identify the correct summative assessment, follow this guidance when selecting the appropriate assessment to use. If on test day you're presented with a question that asks you to use a summative assessment to assess students against a set of standards or achievement, use a standardized test. Next example, if your exam asks you how to measure understanding of a unit content, specific unit content, perhaps science unit or social studies, in that case, you're going to want to use the end of unit exam. And next, if you need to find an answer on your multiple choice section to evaluate the comprehension, writing, and communication skills of your students, use projects and presentations. Next, we'll transition from selecting the summative assessment to administering the summative assessment. When doing so, keep these three frameworks in mind. Number one, ensure a quiet, conducive environment, proper and ready for testing. Two, clearly communicate instructions and expectations. And number three, provide appropriate timeframes for completion. Jumping back to the current description statement for this lesson, we can see that we've covered the first requirement, knows how to select and administer formative and summative assessments to students in grades 4 through 6. Great. Now let's transition to the next part, which is learning to use results to measure literacy skills, where we'll go all over 6 literacy skills that you need to know for your exam and give you specific methods to measure them in the classroom. Let's keep going. Starting with an outline, as you can recall at the very beginning of the lesson, the Texas Education Agency told us in the descriptive statement that we'll need to know how to measure for these literacy skills. Word analysis and identification, fluency, comprehension, writing conventions and written communications, visual images, inquiry skills. Excellent. Now we have to recall the specific literacy skills that we'll need to know how to measure. Let me give you the inside scoop on exactly what to look for. Starting at the top with word analysis and word identification skills, for phonics tests, assess the ability of the student to use letter-sound relationships. For measuring roots and affixes, check understanding of base words, prefixes, and suffixes. And next, use vocabulary quizzes in order to determine word identification and understanding of word meanings. Next, we'll move to measuring fluency, where we use timed readings to measure speed and accuracy, where students read a passage within a set time frame. And then next, we use oral reading to evaluate students' pace, expression, and accuracy during the reading. Moving next to comprehension, where you're going to want to use reading response questions to post reading questions to gauge the student's understanding of what they just read. And then next, we'll use discussion groups by grouping discussions on readings, which reveal students' depth of understanding and interpretation of a text passage. And lastly, for comprehension, we use reciprocal teaching to facilitate summarizing, questioning, clarifying, and predicting all about a text. Wonderful. Next, let's move into measuring writing conventions and written communications, where on your exam, you'll be asked to look for a student's writing assignments, writing conventions, and written communications, where you'll be looking for writing assignments, which us teachers use to assess grammar, punctuation, and organization through assigning essays, reports, and short stories. Next, for the writing convention and written communication, we use peer reviews, where students assess each other's work, providing feedback on clarity, structure, and conventions. Great. Next, let's move to measuring visual images. Image analysis by using images with accompanying questions to interpret meaning, mood, and messages. Now we have media literacy assignments. Here we're going to analyze advertisements, infographics, or visual media, assessing students' understanding of the messages that are portrayed in these media pieces that are visual. Excellent. Now let's move into our 6th literacy skill. In doing so, we have inquiry skills, and we use these to measure what we want for our research projects. Now, here we're going to evaluate the ability to form questions, do research, and draw conclusions. And then also problem-solving tasks to assess a student's approach in order to come up with a solution. Absolutely fantastic. Those are the ways that you'll want to keep in mind on test day regarding measuring specific literacy skills for our students. Next, let's do a quick litmus test. So far, we've covered topic 1 and now topic 2, and let's jump straight into addressing individual students' needs identified in informal and formal assessments. So, how do we do that? Well, let's learn now. Once assessments are administered, interpreting the results becomes vital. In this section, you'll learn how to interpret results of assessments to determine whether a student is performing below, at, or above the expected level of performance. Teachers collect and analyze assessment data in order to determine which students have and have not yet met the standard being taught using these 3 categories: below expectations, meeting expectations, or exceeding expectations. Students whose assessment indicates a below expectations results mean that the student has not yet met the standard. The second result is meeting the standard. In this case, the student's assessment results indicate that the student has met the standard. And finally, exceeding the standard, which through analysis of the assessment results indicate that the student's skill has not only met, but actually exceeded the expectation standard. Keep in mind that for your exam, you'll want to be able to demonstrate your understanding of creating lessons systematically. Instead of creating lessons haphazardly, we use a system through the results that we collect based on assessments. Furthermore, teachers use the assessments to create individual student profiles which show whether the student scored below, at, or exceeding expectations. Then, the teacher takes the individual profiles to create the class profile, which also includes the standards taught to show how effective the instruction and activities have been in teaching the whole class. Based on these profiles, the teacher then uses the data to systematically plan effective instruction, where the teacher can adjust the instruction and provide differentiated instruction to meet the needs of all the individual learners in the classroom. And ultimately, reassess to determine whether the relevant standards have been met. Now, the important thing to note here is that whether the teacher gives a formative or summative assessment, the teacher still needs to proceed with the same systematic process of assessing, profiling, lesson planning based on individual needs, and analyzing student results, and the cycle continues. Sections 1 and 2 are complete, and now also Section 3. Need to pass your TExES core subjects exam? Click the link in the description below to get prepared faster, smarter, better, with everything you need all in one place, so you ace your exam and become a certified teacher with TeacherPreps.com.